And all you have to do really is let it set in a bowl and let it rise for a few hours, and then we'll come back to it.
So when we're looking at these two fractions, 3/8 and 3/16, let's look at them one at a time. So let's start out with 3/8 of an ounce of salt. Remember, we're talking about ounces. We're talking about 3/8. The first thing I notice is that 3/8 is less than half, because remember, 4/8 would be half. So we're talking about a little bit less than half of an ounce, just slightly less than half of an ounce when we're talking about 3/8. Now, when we're talking about 3/16, we're talking about a number even smaller than that, because remember, 8/16 would be half. So I'm actually looking at a little closer to half of a half, because if I half that, we would have 4/16. Now, 4/16, skip a page, 4/16 is the same thing as 1/4, because if we did 4 and then 4 more, we would have 8, then 4 more, we would have 12, then 4 more, we would have 16. So 4/16 is the same as 1/4. So I'm saying that 3/16 is pretty close to a fourth. It's going to be a little bit smaller than a fourth. So over here, 3/8, we're talking about a little bit smaller than a half. 3/16, we're talking about a little bit smaller than a fourth. Now, something that I quickly notice is if we look at the numerator of these two fractions, we notice they're the same. We have three pieces, 3/8 and 3/16. So the biggest difference between these two fractions is my denominator. So here we have an 8, and here we have a 16. Now remember, one thing that we know with fractions is that as our denominator gets bigger, those pieces are getting tinier. So when we're talking about eighths, we're talking about something split up into 8 groups. So it's split up into 8 pieces. So those pieces are going to be much bigger. Versus when we're talking about 16ths over here, we're talking about something split up into 16 pieces, twice as many pieces, which means those pieces are going to be much smaller. Now, because of this, and because we have the same amount of pieces, we can say that if we're looking at 3/8 and 3/16, taking 3/16 is kind of like taking 3/8 and splitting it in half. 3/8 and splitting it in half, and I'm going to show you why. Now, if I were to take 3/8 and I were to change my denominator so that we had the same denominator. So in order to get from 8 to 16, I would have to multiply by 2. So I'm going to do the same thing on the top. Remember to keep our fraction relationship. 8 times 2 is 16. 3 times 2 is 6. 3/8 is the same thing as 6/16. So actually 3/16 is half of 3/8. It's like taking that fraction and cutting it in half. Now, this tells us a lot. This tells us that actually we're going to need half as much yeast as we do salt. So whatever amount of salt we have, we're going to have half of that in yeast. Now, I kind of struggle a little bit with saying, well, how do I measure 3/8 of an ounce? Well, one thing I did is I used a digital scale, and when I used that digital scale, it measures in grams. So what I did was I asked my Google. I said, how many grams are in 3/8 of an ounce?
Hey Google, how many grams are in 3/8 of an ounce?
0.375 ounce is 10.631 grams.
And it told me that in 3/8 of an ounce, we have 10.631, or 10 and 631 thousandths grams. That's how many grams we have. Now from that, if I know that 3/16 is half of 3/8, it's like taking 3/8 and splitting it in half, we can then go back and say, well, if that's how much salt we needed, could we figure out how much yeast that we needed based upon the fact that 3/16 is half of 3/8? And we can do that. So thinking about that relationship between 3/8 and 3/16 by looking at my numerator and noticing they're the same, And then by looking at my denominator and noticing that as my number gets bigger in my denominator, my pieces are getting significantly smaller.
Let's check to see if the pizza's ready. Oh, it's looking good. And we have a finished